I did not mention it earlier, but in case you've missed it, the sanctuary looks a little different than it normally does. Ellis was here this morning and he was looking at it on camera to see what it was going to look like online. And he said, I think we're framed pretty good up there. And I said, just as long as it doesn't look like a seagull is sitting on my head, we're in great shape. And he assured me that didn't appear to be that way. So for that, I am grateful to those countless people who have spent countless hours up here this week and prior to this week getting decorations done. Our kids always seem to have a great time at Vacation Bible School. And somebody asked me this morning, said, what's this year's theme? I said, it's the same as every year's theme. Jesus. That's it. So I didn't really know, so I didn't have the answer. Anyway, if you have your Bibles or New Testaments with you, I invite you to turn again to Mark's Gospel, chapter 10. I want us to read some verses from Mark's Gospel that will serve as our text for this morning. Mark chapter 10, and we're going to begin reading in verse 46. Beginning in verse 46, Mark tells us and his readers that then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him. So they called the blind man. Cheer up. On your feet, he's calling you. Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked him. And the blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. Go, said Jesus. Your faith has healed you. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. As Mark tells us this particular story, Jesus and his disciples are continuing on their way to Jerusalem in order that they might observe the Passover. And as was customary in that day, crowds would begin to gather with pilgrims as they were making their way to Jerusalem, especially if someone in the group was teaching. Because you see, the caravans of people became really and literally nothing more than walking classrooms. And even if there were those who were not going to go all the way to Jerusalem, they would nevertheless perhaps walk a few miles with those who would then complete the journey. And since Jesus had a reputation as a good teacher, a teacher that courageously challenged the religious authorities, no doubt many people walked with him, and my guess is we're listening very carefully to what he said. And as Jesus and his disciples, along with a large crowd, Mark tells us, is leaving Jericho, their caravan passes by a blind man named Bartimaeus. And when he heard that Jesus was near, he began to shout, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And he continued repeating that cry, even though there were those around him who were trying to silence him. And upon finally hearing Bartimaeus, Jesus comes to a complete stop. Call him here, he said. Well, Bartimaeus wasted absolutely no time throwing off his cloak in order that he could run and get to Jesus even faster. And once he arrived, Jesus looked at him and asked him, he said, what exactly do you want me to do for you? Does that question sound familiar? Bartimaeus answers Jesus' question with these words, Master, teacher, my prayer is that I might see again. which indicates at one time he had sight. And Jesus very simply responds, "Go, your faith has healed you." And Mark tells us that immediately he was healed and he followed Jesus with everyone else. The fact that Bartimaeus was willing to make such a scene on this particular day as Jesus passed by, because Bartimaeus was willing to cry out and to continue crying out even when attempting to be silenced, it indicates how desperate he was. It indicates not only how desperate he was, but it also indicates, I think, how much confidence he had in Jesus. In fact, in Mark's gospel, Bartimaeus was the very first to address Jesus as the expected Messiah from the line of David. Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? Isn't it interesting that a blind beggar could see in the person of Jesus what others could not? You see, adversity sometimes can be a very good teacher. Now, I got a couple of questions at this point. That's not one of them. Couple of questions at this point. Has anybody in here ever been shunned or ignored or overlooked or given the impression that you really just weren't worth much? I mean, have you ever had anything happen to you that might help you to identify with Bartimaeus in some way? Because you see, in that culture as well as ours, beggars are often looked upon as simply nobodies. In fact, oftentimes in that day as well as our own, the only time some people will even speak to them is to simply remind them of their insignificance. My second question is this: do you have any idea what rejection does to a person? Do you realize how devastating it can be to their own sense of self-worth, their own self-esteem? And more importantly, do you know how it makes a person feel that no one is willing to hear their cries for help? As I mentioned earlier, Bartimaeus, I think the fact that he was willing to create this kind of commotion simply goes to show you how desperate he was. And my question for us is this: have we ever felt so lonely that we reached that level of despair? And if we have, then hopefully we're committed to at least trying to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else around us. As I read the text this week, another question that came to my mind is, why would the people around Bartimaeus, why would they rebuke him? Why would they try and silence him? Simply put, it was because they considered him to be nothing more than a nuisance. Plus the fact that probably the more he was shouting, the more difficult it became to hear Jesus as he talked along the journey. My guess is those people who were walking with Jesus were also convinced that Jesus really just didn't have time for Bartimaeus. You know, Jesus is too important. Jesus is way too busy. Which then begs the question, why on earth would Jesus stop and call for Bartimaeus? Because simply, I think it's because, how could the man who had told the parable of the Good Samaritan, how could he possibly do otherwise? How many of you remember the words that Jesus read in the synagogue in Nazareth when he began his public ministry? Luke records it for us in chapter 4. When Jesus stood to read in the synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth, when he began his public ministry, he took the scroll, and these are the words that he read. "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened upon him, and he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Now let me ask you, how could the person who spoke those words not stop and help Bartimaeus? Is it possible that for Jesus, hearing the pleas for help by people that others ignored was simply the essence of the faith of Jesus? And then we have the question of why on earth would he heal Bartimaeus? I mean, after all, he refused the request of James and John in the previous passage in Mark's gospel. You remember James and John? And Jesus asked them in the previous chapter, he says, "Hey, what do you want me to do for you?" The same question he asked Bartimaeus. Jesus didn't respond to their request, did he? Because you see, it would appear, at least to me, that Jesus is simply not interested in granting requests for positions of honor and positions of privilege. He was, however, more than eager to help people see those or things that would make life better for them and for those around them. And I think the placement of this story in Mark's gospel is very strategic. It comes at the end of a block of material in Mark that begins and ends with Jesus healing two blind men. Okay? I don't think it's coincidental. I think it is symbolic of the disciples' inability to discern Jesus' mission and Jesus' purpose. The dialogue between Jesus and his disciples while on their way from Galilee to Jerusalem, I think, reveals that. Because 3 times on this journey, Jesus has told his disciples that he would be rejected by the religious authorities, that he would suffer, and that he would die. Apparently the disciples couldn't hear it or couldn't comprehend it. Okay? And then when he told them that he came to serve others and not be served, how did they respond? They responded by asking for positions of honor and privilege. And when he reminded them that in God's kingdom the first would be last and the last would be first, they asked to be placed where? At the front of the line. In other words, the disciples may not have been physically blind, but there's absolutely no doubt that they were spiritually blind. It reinforced by the last healing miracle in Mark's gospel. Because our text that we read for today is Mark's final attempt to expose the disciples' poor eyesight, even as he sought to open the eyes of those who would read his gospel. It's a story that serves as a call to discipleship. A call to discipleship for them and for us. Because it is a text that I think tries to answer the question of what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? Simply put, it means that we will do everything in our power to make absolutely sure that no one is left behind. Because you see, in God's kingdom and in God's ethic, community embraces everyone. Many of you will recall, not the younger ones, but some of you, may recall that there was a time in our not too distant history where we kept hearing the educational slogan, "No child left behind." Okay? Spiritually, that needs to be expanded to this: no person left behind. I don't think there's a clearer message from the Gospel of Mark. Repeatedly, Mark has told his readers about Jesus reaching out to those in society that were ignored by society. There's the Gadarene demoniac, There's the Syrophoenician woman. There's the blind man in Bethsaida. There's even little children. And Bartimaeus is yet another example of Jesus' inclusiveness. It should serve as a reminder to us that we, as disciples of Jesus Christ, are to leave no person behind. And I think it's a story that clearly reminds us that it's the responsibilities of believers, that is, it's the responsibility of Christ followers, to respond to those in need rather than simply overlooking them or worse yet, trying to hide them. Because I think, like Jesus, hearing the cries of help by others should serve as a reminder, that the need to help others that people are trying to silence is the essence of our faith. Rather than being annoyed by those who cry out help, we should be upset by the actions of those who seek to silence them. Because I'm become convinced that it's our responsibility as individuals and as a church to be a voice for the voiceless. To be an advocate for the powerless. I mean, look carefully at verse 49. The word call is used 3 times in that one verse. Jesus stopped and said what? Call him. Okay? So what did they do? They called to the blind man. Cheer up, on your feet. He's what? Calling you. But surely you can see the significance in Mark using that term 3 times. It's the duty of the church to call outsiders to the forefront. It's the duty of the church to take those outsiders and make their needs known. Because if you and I don't do it, the question becomes who will? And I have this growing fear that nobody else will. Okay? Years ago, there was a celebration of Pentecost service that was being hosted by the Regional Council of Churches in Atlanta. And the service was being held at the Peachtree Christian Church in downtown Atlanta. And the featured preacher at this particular service was the Dr. James A. Forbes Jr., who at the time was the senior minister of the Riverside Church in New York City, and by the way, had also been named by Newsweek magazine as one of the most effective preachers in the English-speaking world. Not just North America, but in the English-speaking world. Okay? Preaching at this particular service, I want you to listen to what Dr. Forbes said. Quote, "We must get out of the cul-de-sacs of religiosity and join others on the road of life. We must listen for the cries of those who are hurting and go help them." And then he continued, "Do you hear the cries of that mother who put her child to bed hungry? What about the father that has no health insurance who's having chest pains? What about the child that is an orphan because his parents died of AIDS? What about the family that is heating their home with a dangerous kerosene heater because the electricity was shut off? What about the couple paying exorbitant interest rates on a loan simply to repair their car? Do you hear these people crying from where you are?" End quote. It disturbs me, sadly, to say that I don't think most of us do. I don't think most of us do. Furthermore, building this inclusive community, here's the thing. It's only going to be accomplished one person at a time. Okay? One person at a time. Notice how specific Jesus was. It's crazy. It's crazy. I don't think meeting the needs of the world, I don't think that's something that's going to be done on a large scale. I don't think it's something that's going to be done more quickly. I think it's going to be done one person at a time. And for that reason, do not ever think that what you do to help just one person is somehow insignificant or is somehow unimportant. Because I'm becoming increasingly convinced that that is God's design for changing the world, one person at a time. Now, maybe you have heard the story about a man that was walking the beach. And that man was simply picking up starfish that had been swept onto the shore by the ocean, and he was tossing them back out into the ocean. Well, someone else walking down the beach asked him, said, what exactly are you doing? And he said, well, a lot of these starfish have been washed up on the shore by the ocean. I'm simply picking them up and returning them to the ocean. To which the person kind of grinned and snickered and said, well, let me ask you, what difference is it going to make since there are so many starfish on the beach? To which the gentleman held up the starfish in his hand and simply said, it's going to make a huge difference to this one. A huge difference to this one. It's not rocket science. It's about following Jesus, being his advocate for those less fortunate. It's how we change the world, one person at a time. Understanding that if not but for the grace of God, there go we so often. You know? But here's the thing. Transferring what I have said today from the head to the heart, that's the hard part. That's the difficulty. You see, hearing and responding to the cries of those that others try to silence requires a strong level of commitment to be the presence of Christ in a blind and deaf world. Bringing the plight of those individuals to the world's attention, that's going to take time. And it's also going to take resources. And for that reason, I'm convinced you and I can't do it without God's help. Okay? You say, well, what do you mean you don't think we can do it without God? Why can't we do it without God's help? I'll tell you why. Because after all, we are all far too busy, too distracted, and quite honestly, too self-centered. I mean, really, it's going to require an answer similar to Bartimaeus when Jesus asked us, what do you want me to do for you? Because there are few questions that are more capable of exposing our true nature, few questions more capable of exposing our priorities than to simply have Jesus ask us that question. What do you want me to do for you? Because in answering that question, you show God your values and your priorities. Okay? Perhaps you and I would need to answer to that question by asking Jesus to open our eyes. In order that we might see more clearly his mission for us and our roles in that mission. And the reason I say that is because, let's face it, there are a lot of things that often cloud our vision. There are an awful lot of things that can redirect our focus. And it's only going to be with God's help that we can look beyond them, in order that we might see that which is really important. And what's really important to God is how we respond to those around us who are in need, who are seeking God. who understand what it takes to make a difference in this world, one person at a time, but also being committed to making that difference.